Why the U.S. gave up Cuba after the Spanish-American War. In the summer of 1898, the United States emerged victorious from a short but decisive war against Spain. This conflict, known as the Spanish-American War, lasted only a few months but had vast consequences. One of the most significant outcomes was the end of Spanish rule in the Caribbean and the Pacific. The Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10, 1898, marked Spain's formal surrender and the end of its colonial empire in the Americas. Cuba, long under Spanish rule, was at the center of these changes. However, unlike Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, territories that the United States kept, Cuba was allowed to become an independent nation. The reasons behind this decision were complex and deeply rooted in both domestic and international politics. Cuba had been a colony of Spain for nearly 4 centuries, but by the late 1800s, Cuban nationalists had grown increasingly restless under Spanish control. 3 decades of armed resistance movements culminated in the 10 Years' War, 1868 to 1878, and later the Cuban War of Independence, 1895 to 1898. The brutality of Spanish suppression, particularly the use of concentration camps by Spanish General Valeriano Villena, attracted global condemnation. In the United States, public sympathy for the Cuban struggle surged, fueled by sensationalist newspapers that published emotional stories of suffering and resistance. At the same time, economic interests played a major role. American businessmen had heavily invested in Cuban sugar plantations, and political leaders were concerned about regional stability so close to the U.S. mainland. When the U.S. battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898, killing over 260 American sailors, the incident was quickly blamed on Spain. Though the actual cause remains debated, it served as the tipping point. On April 25, 1898, the U.S. Congress declared war on Spain. The war was swift. Within months, U.S. forces, aided by Cuban insurgents, had defeated Spanish troops in Cuba. Simultaneously, American naval forces overwhelmed Spain's presence in the Pacific, particularly in the Philippines. Spain was left with little choice. By the end of the year, it had agreed to relinquish its claims on Cuba and cede Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the United States. Despite its victory, the U.S. government did not annex Cuba outright. Instead, Cuba was placed under temporary U.S. military occupation. From 1898 to 1902, American officials governed the island, reorganizing its legal system, education, sanitation, and infrastructure. Yet throughout this period, the U.S. maintained that it had no intention of keeping Cuba permanently. This was not just a diplomatic posture. It was enshrined in American law through the Teller Amendment. Passed by Congress in April 1898, before the war had even begun, the Teller Amendment was a declaration of principle. It stated that the United States would not establish permanent control over Cuba. The amendment reflected the views of many anti-imperialists in the U.S., who believed that American involvement should be limited to liberating oppressed peoples, not acquiring colonies. It also responded to Cuban nationalist demands for independence. The amendment served as a promise that the United States would not betray the cause of Cuban freedom. Still, when the war ended, many in Washington viewed Cuba as a valuable and strategically located territory. The island was just 90 miles south of Florida and had significant agricultural potential. But legal and political commitments restrained U.S. ambitions. Instead of annexation, American officials opted for control through indirect means. In 1901, the U.S. Congress passed the Platt Amendment, a new policy that would define Cuban-American relations for years. The amendment, later incorporated into Cuba's own constitution, allowed the U.S. to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever necessary to preserve independence and order. It also granted the U.S. the right to lease land for military purposes, which led to the establishment of the naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Though Cuba was technically independent after 1902, the Platt Amendment ensured that its sovereignty remained limited. The U.S. decision not to annex Cuba outright was driven by several key factors. First, American leaders were wary of provoking backlash both at home and abroad. The U.S. had long promoted itself as a defender of liberty and anti-colonialism. Annexing Cuba would undermine that image and invite accusations of hypocrisy. Second, the Cuban resistance movement was powerful and persistent. Many Cubans had fought and died for independence, and any attempt by the U.S. to claim the island as their own would likely have sparked widespread rebellion. American policymakers preferred a stable protectorate to a costly and unpopular occupation. Third, domestic politics in the U.S. played a role. The anti-imperialist movement was gaining strength at the turn of the century, especially among intellectuals, former presidents, and members of Congress. They viewed imperialism as a threat to American democracy and warned against entanglements in foreign lands. Finally, the U.S. didn't need to own Cuba in order to benefit from it. Economic dominance was enough. American companies quickly became major players in Cuban agriculture, banking, and transportation. With political influence secured through the Platt Amendment and economic power expanding rapidly, the U.S. could control key aspects of Cuba's future without formally making it a state or colony. Thus, by 1902, Cuba was declared an independent republic. A Cuban flag was raised over Havana, and a Cuban president took office. But the U.S. maintained an outsized presence in Cuban life. Its troops had left, but its influence remained. In the decades that followed, U.S.-Cuba relations would go through many phases: intervention, investment, revolution, hostility. But the foundation was laid in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. The U.S. had the power to take Cuba, but chose a different path. It was a mix of principle and pragmatism, shaped by political promises, strategic interests, and international pressures. Though Cuba was not annexed, it remained within America's sphere of influence for more than half a century. Only the Cuban Revolution of 1959, which overthrew the U.S.-backed Batista regime, would fully end that era of indirect control. Still, the decision in 1898 to let Cuba go formally while maintaining strategic leverage remains a defining moment in American foreign policy. A moment when empire was pursued not through flags and borders, but through agreements, amendments, and influence.